All the Young Dudes, Sirius's Perspective by Rollercosterwords. Chapter 82, 5th Year, Aftermath. As it turned out, Sirius didn't have to pretend to be asleep when Mrs. Potter woke up. She agreed with his friend's decision not to summon Dumbledore immediately. Mr. Potter concurred as well, and they all elected to try and salvage the morning as best they could by opening presents. At first, Mr. Potter suggested that they apparate all of the gifts up to Sirius's bedroom, but he refused. "My legs work fine," he said, standing up to prove his point. "I want to come down and see the tree." Mrs. Potter still looked a bit wary about the idea of having him out of bed, but at Sirius's insistence she relented, and they all dispersed to go wash up and dress. Sirius smiled cheerfully until the last person was out the door, only sagging back onto the bed once he was safely alone. It wasn't that he was hurt, aside from the bump on the back of his head where it had hit the floor when he'd fallen, and a few scattered bruises that were signs of some sort of writhing or flailing that Sirius didn't remember. There were no physical signs of what had happened. Even the bruises were already fading, thanks to Mrs. Potter's healing magic. But he felt drained. A bone-deep exhaustion had burrowed into his limbs, and his body protested as he dragged it into the bathroom, wanting nothing more than to crawl back into the warm bed and curl up under the blankets for a long, long time. In the mirror, his eyes were necrotic. "Don't think about it," he told himself, firmly. The Potters' living room was unfailingly joyful, with its brightly wrapped presents and its festive holly wreaths and twinkling Christmas lights. Sirius began to feel a bit better as he sat, cocooned in a blanket and sipping tea on the sofa. Strips of torn wrapping paper fell like confetti across the floor, paired with excited exclamations. There was a stack of presents for Sirius, even though no one had planned on him attending, and James's presents promised even more. "We'll get you some nice pictures to brighten up your room," Mrs. Potter said, using her wand to sweep all the discarded boxes into a pile. "Which Quidditch team do you support, sweetheart? Or perhaps one of those rock stars you kids like? Your room." The words took a moment to sink in, and when they did, Sirius was hit with such an overwhelming wave of joy and gratitude that he could have drowned in it. How many times had he wished, over the years, that the Potters were his family? How often had he fantasized, pretending that James was his brother, Euphemia his mother, Fleamond his father, that he could wake up here, in this house, every day. "Most of my stuff is at Hogwarts," he said, feeling slightly dazed. "It's just clothes at home." He thought, suddenly, of the rude posters on his walls, and flushed, embarrassed. He certainly had no desire to retrieve those. "Well, you can borrow some of James's things for a little while. Perhaps we'll go shopping in the new year." Lunch was a quiet affair, just the 5 of them and Gully. The house elf scuttered about, humming cheerfully and carrying what seemed to be an endless procession of food onto the table. He was just about to set light to the Christmas pudding when a loud crack came from outside the gate, the telltale sign of apparition. Sirius jumped, startled, heart crawling into his throat. His body screamed, "Run, run, run," but he stayed put. He was safe here. This was his home. Mr. Potter gave them all a reassuring smile and hurried to the door, leaving the rest of them to listen intently from the table. "Albus, Merry Christmas." "Fleamont? I take it Sirius has had his rest?" "Yes, we're just about to have—" "I did request that you contact me as soon as he woke up." "Come in, Dumbledore. Join us for some pudding." Sirius's heartbeat, which had just begun to calm down, kicked up again as their headmaster swept into the room. He looked very sombre, face deeply lined and mouth set in a steady frown. Following behind him was a grizzled, stocky man dressed in a brown leather trench coat. His dark eyes scanned the room suspiciously, and the scrutinizing look he gave Sirius only put him more on edge. "Albus, Alistair," Mrs. Potter stood, waving her wand to conjure up 2 additional places at the table, chairs and all. "Won't you join us for some pudding?" "Not now, Effie," the shorter man, Alistair, grunted. "On duty." Mrs. Potter responded with one of her trademark looks, and Alistair quickly changed his mind, clearing his throat and sitting down like a scolded child. Sirius might have found it funny if his heart wasn't crawling up the back of his tongue, making him gag. Dumbledore sat down across from him, staring with an unreadable expression. Just one day, Sirius thought desperately. I just wanted one day. Was that so much to ask? Still, he dropped his eyes, looking down at the table in shame. There was nothing overtly disappointing in the headmaster's gaze, but he still squirmed with guilt, knowing that he had disobeyed the wizard's orders of his own selfish reasons. "Sirius," Dumbledore said quietly. "How are you?" "Fine," he responded politely, staring blankly at the dark pudding in the centre of the table. Gully snapped his fingers, and it was suddenly crawling with blue flame, flickering like a will-o'-wisp. "I'd like to discuss last night's events with you," Dumbledore continued. "I know it isn't pleasant, and you may wish to forget, but anything you tell me might be useful, do you understand?" "Yes, fine," as if he could ever forget. The memory had already been trying to claw its way out from the back of his mind all day. Sirius nodded. The flame died, and Gully snapped sharply once again. The pudding separated into 8 neat portions, all exactly equal in size. Sirius ate without tasting, chewing just to feel his jaw ache. The silence coiled like a dragon in the middle of the table, heavy and scaled. "Not seeing your family today, Moody?" Mr. Potter asked politely. Alistair shook his head. "The job comes first. I'll be here as long as you need me." "We're very grateful," Mrs. Potter said warmly. James's dad turned to the boys, explaining, "Alistair's an aura." Sirius swallowed, turning to study the gruff man. He had never met an aura before, but he had certainly heard what his parents said about them, along with most of the rest of the ministry. His parents. Sirius left most of his pudding untouched. His stomach was unsteady, and he already felt a bit sick as they all returned to the living room. He sat on the sofa, with James and Remus on either side. Part of him wanted to ask them to leave. He couldn't bear the thought of things changing, of his friends looking at him like he was some vulnerable or broken, something to be pitied. But a bigger part of him was scared, and needed them by his side. "I hope this won't take long," Dumbledore said, with a pleasant smile, settling into an armchair across from the boys. "Sirius, we just need to know anything that you can remember about the events which led to you arriving here at 11 o'clock last night." "Was that the time?" Sirius asked numbly. "I thought it was later." Everything had been so hazy, blurring together. What time had Bellatrix followed him into the library? What time had his parents left? How long had it taken him to drag his body across the floor to the fireplace? It felt like forever. Dumbledore smiled, folding his hands in his lap. "In your own time, please." Sirius cleared his throat, trying to shove his heart back down into its rightful place in his chest. He couldn't hold Dumbledore's penetrating gaze. Instead he looked at James, who gave him a gentle smile. "You're safe," he reminded himself. "You're safe, you're here with James, and you're going to stay here, and you're safe." He turned back to Dumbledore. I thought it would be okay. I never really got on with my family since I'm in Gryffindor, you know. But they were being so much nicer than usual. They were only lecturing, not even shouting, really. My dad's even said I was talented. I thought it would be okay. We have a family dinner every year on Christmas Eve. The whole family. Who was there? Moody asked. When Sirius glanced over, he had a quill out, parchment floating in front of his chest to take notes. All of the Blacks, Sirius tried to remember. He hadn't exactly paid careful attention. It had all been such a flurry of dress robes and wine and cursory chit-chat. And the Lestrangers, the Malfoys, Narcissa and her husband, anyway. Not Andromeda, obviously. The Goyles arrived later, and the Knotts, the Crabs. Barty Crouch was visiting. He's friends with my brother. "Crouch?" Moody asked sharply, Quill pausing. Dumbledore inclined his head. "That would be Bartimus Jr., of course." "Yes," Sirius confirmed. "Little git. Quite the gathering, eh, Albus?" Moody muttered. "Quiet, please." "Sirius, do go on." "So, yeah, it was just normal, really. Normal for us. Dinner, dancing, snobby stuff. He hesitated, shame creeping up his spine. "They toasted to Voldemort. I didn't join in, though, Professor, I swear. It was sort of jokey. I don't even know if they were serious or not. Dad was a bit drunk. Dumbledore's expression didn't even flicker. Not a sign of condemnation or absolution. Sirius looked down at his feet, speaking quickly, words spilling out, tripping over each other. I was supposed to talk to James at 8, so I tried to sort of sneak off. My cousin, Bellatrix, she caught me and cornered me in the library. She said I was nearly of age, and it was time that I start taking my role as the heir more seriously, leave my friends behind and grow up. I told her to... well, I wasn't very nice. She called my parents, Reg came too, and Crouch, and I wasn't worried because, well, everyone knows Bella's a bit bonkers, so I thought they'd just tell her to stay out of it. But they didn't. They sided with her. Dad said... he said he wanted me to make him proud for once. I told him I was trying, but... this isn't a game, boy. Sirius sucked in a breath, wishing he could scrub his father's voice from his head, wishing he could scrub away all of it, till his mind was raw and red and bleeding and clean. Anyway, they wanted me to swear allegiance to Voldemort. I thought they were joking. They were saying all sorts of mad stuff about Muggleborns and blood traitors, and then Bellatrix showed me her arm. She's got this tattoo. He looked up, realising as he said it that the information might be useful. It's a dark mark, sir. The skull and snake. She said she had chosen a side, and it was time for me to choose mine. You're a traitor. A blood traitor. I said no. There's still time to prove your loyalty. I said it so many times. He dropped his head, eyes sliding closed. It was all so clear, just the slightest nudge, and he was back on the library floor, shattering. And did they hurt you for it? Dumbledore prompted. They tried to persuade you? He could hear it, so clearly. Crucio! Yes. Bellatrix did this? Tout juste pure. No. Your mother. Your father? My mother, my father, my mother. He forced himself to nod, to speak. They took turns. Mrs. Potter stood abruptly, leaving the room. Sirius tried to breathe, but his lungs weren't working properly. The air turned to smoke, filling his throat. But you managed to escape, Dumbledore pressed gently. Another nod. After a while, I must have stopped saying no, because, well, it just hurt too much. I couldn't say anything. And they must have needed me to agree, because they all left me there. They locked me in the library. But there's a fireplace there, and flue powder. I don't know. Maybe they wanted me to go. There. That was it. Sirius felt sick, slightly dizzy, as if he'd accidentally vomited on the Potter's living room carpet. Thank you, Sirius, Dumbledore said, in a voice you might use to a frightened animal. This has been a great help. I won't disrupt your Christmas any further. He stood, turning to Mr. Potter. Your offer to house Sirius until he comes of age still stands, I assume? As much as it did when he was 12, Mr. Potter said, straightening as he spoke. Sirius blinked away the tears pricking at his eyes. He'd never been so grateful for anything in his entire life. He wasn't sure what he'd ever done to deserve the Potters. Excellent, Dumbledore nodded. I shall see you boys in January, then. Wait! Sirius scrambled to his feet before their headmaster could leave. Professor, what about my brother? Dumbledore turned to look back at him with those horrifyingly neutral eyes. Do you believe Regulus is in danger? Yes, Merlin, yes. I can't save him, not on my own. I don't think they'll hurt him. He's good at doing what he's told. He only wants to please our parents. But they'll make him join Voldemort. He'll get marked. He's 16 next year, and does Regulus want to leave? Dumbledore may as well have ripped his heart out from his chest and handed it to him, hematic and beating. He thought of Reggie, carrying his chest set to the library. Reggie holding clean bandages like an offering. Reggie scowling as Sirius burnt his note. Reggie rolling his eyes when they passed each other in the hallways. Reggie saying that this wasn't their parents' fault. Saying it so many times, over and over, like he almost believed it. No, not like I did. Then we can't force him. He is in no immediate danger. I'm sorry, Sirius. That's it then, Sirius thought, falling back onto the sofa as Dumbledore left. I'm abandoning him again. He closed his eyes and saw the dark mark etched onto his cousin's skin. Reg. Mr. Potter, Sirius said stiffly, once the door had swung shut. Please may I borrow some parchment? I'd like to write to Andromeda. Of course, my boy, Mr. Potter nodded. Sirius and James followed him upstairs to his study, while Mr. Potter ushered Sirius onto his desk, providing him with a fresh pot of ink, a quill, and an entire sheaf of parchment. James didn't say anything, just sat next to him as he wrote, a solid presence. Andromeda. Something's happened. I'm okay, so don't worry, but I sort of ran away. Or Mum and Dad might have kicked me out, I'm not really sure. Don't think it matters. We all wanted me gone, I guess. I'm staying with the Potters for now. James's dad said I could live with them until I'm of age, so everything's fine. I'm all right. It's really great here. I've got my own room. They're going to let me decorate it however I want. Don't know how I got so lucky. Anyway, you might hear some stuff over the next few days, so I just wanted to let you know that I'm fine, and you don't have to use the Muggle post to write to me anymore. Which will be great. Makes everything easier, doesn't it? Your cousin, Sirius. P.S. Reggie's still with Mum and Dad. Dumbledore says there isn't anything we can do about it, but he doesn't think Reg is in any immediate danger, so it's all right. He'll be fine. The afternoon proved to be unsalvageable. They played a few half-hearted games of chess, but Dumbledore's visit has left a permanent gloom over the house. Eventually they just decided to go to bed early, yawning as they stood and dragged themselves upstairs and piled onto James's bed. Even Remus, who usually preferred to sleep alone. Sirius crawled in between his two friends, curling up in the middle, where it was warmest. Budge up, Moony, he ordered, elbowing the taller boy in the ribs as he tried to get comfortable. Remus retreated to the edge of the bed, as if to give him as much space as possible, which was nice, but Sirius wasn't so fussed if things were a little cramped. He and James fell asleep in the same bed all the time, and he'd gotten used to waking up with his friend's arm flung over his shoulder, or a knee poking him in the back. Sirius listened as James's familiar snoring started up, forcing himself to take deep breaths. His body was exhausted, but his mind was still spinning, thoughts chaotic and jumbled. He was very aware of Remus breathing next to him, still awake. He'd never actually shared a bed with Moony before. From the edge of the bed, there was a light, breathy chuckle. Sirius rolled over, looking at Remus. What are you giggling at, Moony? The other boy shifted slightly, looking back at him, startled. His eyes were very wide and pallid in the moonlight, and very dark. Nothing, he whispered, breath warm and minty with toothpaste. Just not used to sharing a bed. Yeah, and James's snoring is pretty bad. Their faces were close together now. Sirius realised he'd grown used to looking up at Moony, but lying side by side, their eyes were level. He murmured, and Sirius sighed. I can't sleep. I could get James's mum. She might have some more potion. I don't want any more potion, Sirius grumbled, feeling too hot, like his head was buzzing. Well, just shut your eyes then, Remus said, matter of fact. I keep thinking about it. The words slipped out before he could stop them. What was it about Moony that made him feel like he was overflowing, like he couldn't keep anything inside? Oh, sorry. No, not like that. I just mean, it's weird. But while they were doing it, before I sort of stopped thinking, I was thinking about you. Me? Yeah, I was thinking, at least now I know how Moony feels. When we were researching all that stuff to help you out with the full moon, there was a description in one of the records, written by a witch who had lycanthropy. She said the pain of transformation was familiar to that of the Cruciatus curse. Remus frowned. His upper lip was slightly longer than the lower, Sirius noticed, unbalanced. Oh, I never heard that. I don't think it can be. I think Cruciatus must be much worse. Maybe, Sirius whispered. but it helped a bit. I thought, if Mooney can do it, so can I. Remus stared at him, just a few inches away on the mattress. Sirius waited for him to speak, wanting something. He wasn't sure what. Go to sleep, Sirius. He swallowed. All right. Good night. Night. Sirius rolled back over, heart stuttering, and he waited for his mind to switch off. Chapter 83. 5th year, January. Sunday the 4th of January, 1976. Come on, please. No, please. I said no. It's not like it's difficult. You just have to stick it in. And what if I hurt you? You won't. Get James to do it. Sirius pouted. I don't want James to do it. You're better at this stuff, Mooney. Remus sighed. Sirius had been cajoling him for the past 2 hours, slowly wearing him down. I've never pierced anyone's ear in my life, he said, in a resigned sort of voice. How do you know I'm any better at it than James? I just do. Remus rolled his eyes, not bothering to respond, and Sirius began to grin. Come on, Mooney. Do I have to beg? You've been begging, Remus snorted, and Sirius gave him a haughty toss of his hair. That was negotiating. He fell to his knees in front of the sofa where Remus was reading, smirking devilishly. This is begging. Mooney's eyes went wide. What are you? Oh, please, great and powerful Mooney, Sirius proclaimed dramatically, raising his voice. Have mercy on your devoted follower. He reached out, gripping Remus's leg with his hands. Hey, benevolent, sire, for a poor, desperate wretch. Only you can save me from this awful mundanity of having an unadorned ear. Only you can. All right. Remus shoved him off, standing abruptly. Sirius grinned up from the carpet. Is that a yes? Yes, fine. As long as you quit acting like a prat. Deal. The whole thing had started a few days before, when Mrs. Potter took them down to the village to find new shoes for Sirius. There would be no Diagon Alley, per Moody's instructions, even though nothing further had happened with Sirius's parents. He wasn't sure if the Ministry just didn't care enough about the illegal use of magic to investigate, or if Dumbledore was leaving it unreported on purpose. He tried not to think about it too much either way. Sirius had been ecstatic to find a pair of chunky black boots just like the ones Remus had, complete with bright yellow laces. Mrs. Potter insisted on buying them as an additional late Christmas present, even though the Potters had already done so much for Sirius that he had no idea how he'd ever repay them. On the way back home, they'd passed by a group of muggles dressed quite differently from the other residents of the sleepy little town. They were decked out in ripped jeans and leather jackets, slouching against a brick wall, passing a cigarette lazily back and forth. One had a startling green hair, and the other had a row of shiny silver rings in the cartilage of his ear. Sirius was smitten. Mrs. Potter had forbid any hair dyeing, and, counter to the way he felt about his own mother, Sirius would never want to do anything that might upset her. But she hadn't said anything about an earring. Remus used a potato and his prefect pin to do it, sterilizing the pin first. He instructed Sirius to hold an ice cube against his ear as he ran a lighter under the needle, and Sirius complied, waiting for his earlobe to go numb. It took some manoeuvring to find the perfect position for the actual piercing. At first, Sirius sat down on the edge of the tub, but then Remus had to either crouch or kneel, and after a minute or two of awkward adjusting, he finally sighed. Just stand up. Sirius stood. Remus nudged his arm, moving him over to lean back against the sink. Long fingers brushed his jaw as Remus positioned the potato back against his ear, frowning in concentration. Their faces were very close together. Sirius could count the little wrinkles between Mooney's furrowed eyebrows. He swallowed. Will it hurt? He asked, quickly, as Remus raised the pin. His heart was pounding. He felt nervous, shaky. Remus paused. Well, we've numbed it a bit, but yeah, probably. He smiled wryly. Don't be such a girl. Oh, be gentle with me, Mooney, Sirius teased, pretending to swoon. They both laughed, and Remus grabbed his shoulder, shaking him with a fond smile. "Stay still, you big wuss." It did hurt, a bit, and it bled quite a lot. But the next morning Sirius marched downstairs with his hair mused for volume, flipped over one shoulder so that his new gold earring was clearly displayed. He was rather chuffed with it. He presented himself to his friends, shoving his hands in his pockets and pushing back his cloak with his elbows to make sure that everyone could see his new boots. "Muggle in sight," he said to Remus, sticking a cigarette between his teeth to complete the outfit. "How do I look?" "Like a twat," James snorted. "Like a rock star," Remus said. Sirius grinned, nearly letting the cigarette slip out of his mouth. When they arrived at King's Cross, he walked with a swagger, acutely aware of the eyes following him. They'd only made it a few steps past the barrier when Mary spotted him, clacking over in a heeled pair of turquoise shrewd boots that brought her up to his height. "Hiya, gorgeous," she said cheerfully, throwing her arms around his neck. Sirius smiled, pleased by the compliment. He hugged Mary back, breathing in the familiar smell of her perfume. Something vaguely fruity. Her curls tickled his face, and he scrunched up his nose as she pulled back, making her laugh. Mary kept her arm looped with his as they boarded the train, chattering on about her winter holiday. She had 4 younger siblings, and it sounded as if the Christmas had been quite hectic at the MacDonald household. As they sat down in their usual carriage, Sirius prompted Mary with questions. What presents she had gotten for her siblings, what sort of food did her mother make for Christmas? Did any relatives visit? Hoping to avoid the inevitable moment when the subject would flip, and she would ask him about how his break went. He wasn't ready to talk about it yet. Not with Mary. As it turned out, he didn't have to worry. Mary didn't ask about how his holiday had gone. Once she was done talking about her own Christmas, she transitioned smoothly into complaining about how behind she was in history, which James joined in for. Pretty soon, the whole car was talking about coursework, the subject of the holidays forgotten. Their carriage was a bit less crowded than it had been leaving Hogwarts, as both Lily and Remus had abandoned them for prefect duties. But the car was still incredibly noisy, and bustling with chatter from 3 different conversations, by the time they pulled into Hogsmeade. Sirius didn't really consider the deft change in subject until later that evening, when he and Mary were walking back to the common room after dinner. She was complaining about how she'd missed him, cuddling into his arm with a very affectionate way, and Sirius laughed and said without thinking, "Oh, come on. You'll be able to visit me over the summer holiday. Stop whining." "Oh, right," Mary nodded. "You'll be with the Potters, won't you?" Sirius blinked. Yeah," he replied. Did James tell you that? Or—" Mary flushed guiltily, as if realizing what she'd let slip. She looked down quickly, fidgeting with their intertwined fingers. "Oh, no. I just, I heard it from Lily." "Lily?" Sirius frowned, confused. How would Lily know that he'd be moving in with the Potters? Had James told her? "Yeah, she told me that you'd, left home." "Left home?" "Yeah, she said something had happened with your family." Sirius bit back anger. "And how, exactly, did Evans come by that information?" Mary chewed on her lip. "Don't be mad, okay? She heard it from Severus." "Snape?" Mary nodded, and Sirius felt his stomach twist with nausea. It wasn't too difficult to imagine how Snape had found out. His parents' entire network of creepy Voldemort frantics must have loved gossiping about him, about what a disgrace he was. Probably half the Slytherins in school already knew, and of course bloody Snivellus would go running his mouth to anyone who listened. "Sirius, don't be angry," Mary pleaded, tugging on his arm. "I'm not," he lied, struggling to stifle the simmering rage. He didn't want to take his anger out on Mary. It wasn't her fault, after all. No, Sirius knew exactly who to blame. That slimy little git. Thursday, the 15th of January, 1976. Their professors were trying to kill them. It was the only explanation. Sirius was pretty sure that McGonagall alone had assigned enough pages of reading to quite literally bury him alive. With owls just around the corner, the work was piling on every class, until even Sirius had to admit defeat and crack open a textbook to revise. instead of continuing with his tried and tested method of leaving everything until the night before. He wasn't the only one feeling the strain. Every 5th year at Hogwarts was on edge, sporting dark circles and stumbling around the library with haggard expressions. The only person who actually appeared to be enjoying the ridiculous amount of schoolwork was Remus, who had accrued a steady stream of followers that were constantly asking him for help with their essays or incantations. He grumbled about it as if it were a headache, but his friends knew him well enough to catch the small, self-satisfied smile any time a student stopped him in the halls to ask a question. In fact, Moony's little study club was growing so much that the marauders had taken to calling him Professor, which, Sirius had to admit, had a ring to it, and Remus obviously enjoyed teaching, though he rolled his eyes at the nickname every time they used it. He could never stop his lips from quirking up automatically. Unfortunately, his SWAT lifestyle kept Remus incredibly busy. He hardly had any time for maraudering, which Sirius couldn't help but feel a bit resentful about, although Moony made up for it by playing double agent whenever he was carrying out his prefect duties. Even though they teased him about it at the beginning of the year, it was actually quite useful having a prefect in your pocket. James and Sirius knew that they could get away with almost anything when Remus was on patrol, and he unabashedly played favourites and loyally manoeuvred whoever he was patrolling with, usually Lily, in the opposite direction of whatever the marauders were up to. This gave them the opportunity to experiment with even more daring pranks and schemes, and Sirius felt unstoppable as he prowled about the castle with James, hidden under the invisibility cloak. They had a few close calls with Filch, but that only made things more fun. They would return to the common room breathless, laughing, high on adrenaline. When he wasn't making mischief or resenting his professors, Sirius spent most of his time on the Quidditch pitch. The first match against Slytherin had resulted in a tie, which meant that James was whipping the team into a frenzy as they competed for the cup. They practiced twice as often every week, and Potter dragged Sirius out of bed every morning at daybreak to force him on a jog. He complained about it, but privately, Sirius was grateful for the distraction. He was grateful for any distraction. The Slytherins had been just as nasty as ever, but there was a new glint in their eyes when they looked at him. By the end of the first week back, it seemed as though everyone in the entire school knew that he'd been kicked out. Which was fine. Sirius didn't give a toss about his family, or about what other people thought about his family. As far as he was concerned, they were dead to him, dead and buried, deep in the recesses of his mind. But he still had nightmares, dreams that left him screaming himself awake. They dissipated like dust when he woke, leaving only hazy impressions, black ink pouring down his throat, hissing so loud and horrible that it made his ears bleed. Pain, always pain. He started casting silencing spells over his bed after the first night that James shook him awake, brow furrowed with concern, stomach churning pity in the back of his eyes. It didn't matter, they were just dreams. Besides, Sirius had plenty of other things to think about. Endless essays, pages of reading, stacks of assignments, plots for pranks, Quidditch strategies, and of course, there was Mary. She'd said she'd missed him over the holiday, and she hadn't been kidding. It seemed like she was always cuddling up to him, throwing cheeky smiles over her shoulder as she tugged him into the empty classroom, a broom cupboard, once the girls' loos on the 4th floor. Sirius wasn't exactly sure how fast things were meant to progress when you had a girlfriend. He'd heard how some of the older boys talked, of course, but no one ever actually explained the timeline. When were you supposed to move things on from snogging to, well, other things? Sirius was ready for other things. At least, he was pretty sure that he was. He was certainly growing frustrating, spending long minutes with Mary pressed up against him, sighing in his ear, kissing his neck, and then hopping off his lap, bidding him good night with a peck on the cheek before scampering off to her own bed. She'd taken to trailing her fingers up his legs sometimes when they kissed, and Sirius was beginning to wish that she'd just get it over with and touch him. Of course, the thought of him touching her was much more intimidating, the primary reason that Sirius hadn't taken any steps to hurry things along. While he'd certainly gotten the hang of the whole snogging thing, Sirius still felt a bit clueless about what he was meant to do with his hands. Sometimes Mary would huff in frustration and move his fingers to her waist, or her back, or her thigh, and he would grin sheepishly, so lost in the sensation of whatever she'd been doing to him that he'd forgotten that he was supposed to be reciprocating. He knew he'd have to figure it out eventually, but Sirius was mostly content to let Mary take the lead, following whatever pace she set. That was how he found himself, one Thursday night, tucked into an alcove behind a tapestry, with Mary straddling his lap. They had been at it for a solid 15 minutes, when she pulled back, breathing quickly. "Sirius," she whispered, close to his ear. It was quite dark behind the tapestry, so he couldn't see the expression on her face, though he could certainly picture it. "Do you want to touch me?" Yeah," he swallowed, throat suddenly dry. Yeah, I do." This wasn't entirely sure what she was asking, but he'd learnt that when Mary said stuff like that while they were kissing, she usually already had something fairly specific in mind. Sure enough, her arms snaked away from where she'd been wrapped around his neck, and she leaned back slightly. He could feel her hands fumbling between them. "What are you—" "Oh." Bloody hell, she was unbuttoning her blouse. Sirius felt a surge of panic, coupled with heated excitement, as Mary's fingers moved, surprisingly deft in the dark. She reached out and grabbed his hand, placing it on her chest. Sirius swallowed again, and the panic resurfaced. What the fuck was he meant to do? He was forced, abruptly, to confront the fact that he hadn't the faintest clue on how to go about feeling a girl's... her... tits, Sirius thought, in a state of mild shock. "I'm touching her tits." He squeezed, experimentally. They were very soft, and rather squishier than he'd imagined. Sort of like a water balloon, but warmer, much warmer. Mary giggled quietly, leaning forward so that her forehead pressed against his. "Here, like this." He was just beginning to feel like he was doing something. Mary had started making a sort of soft sighing noise in the back of her throat, when voices drifted down the hall. Lacewing flies, dew from a field of clover, seawater, and, Sirius sucked in a breath, trying to keep from laughing. He recognised that voice, the familiar way it trailed off as the owner got lost in thought, brow furrowed, lip poking out. "Oh, come on, Remus," came Lily Evans's voice, sounding as if they were just a few feet down from the tapestry. "This is 4th year stuff." "I know, but I can never—" "Wait, do you hear that?" "What?" "Shh." Sirius held his breath, heart pounding as he listened to Remus's footsteps draw closer and closer until, Lumos! The tapestry was ripped back, light flooding from Lupin's outstretched wand. "Shit!" "Mary!" Lily gasped. "Moony!" Sirius said, grinning sheepishly. "What are you two doing?" Lily demanded, hands on her hips. Sirius couldn't help winking, smirking as he said, "Can't you guess, Evans?" Mary was still halfway on his lap, frantically buttoning up her shirt. "We ought to give you both detention," Lily said sternly, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, be nice, Lily," Mary smiled, rolling her eyes. "Everyone does it. Just a bit of fun." "Well, as this is the first time," Lily sighed. "Come on, we're heading back to the tower now anyway." 5 more minutes?" Sirius teased, just to see Lily's face flush with embarrassment. Mary laughed, slapping his arm playfully. "Bad boy," she giggled, finishing the final button on her shirt. "Come on, it's not like anything else was happening tonight." Mary and Lily walked slightly ahead of them on the way back to the common room, giggling and whispering, sneaking glances back at Sirius every so often. He tucked his hair behind his ear, walking with a slight swagger and winking whenever they looked back. He tried to catch Remus's eye too, with a knowing smile. James would have been nudging him the whole way back to their room, wiggling his eyebrows and grinning cheekily. But Remus stared straight ahead, an irritated frown on his face as they walked. By the time they got back to the common room, Sirius was beginning to feel like he'd done something wrong. Had he offended Remus in some way? The boy continued to frown as they all got ready for bed, a stormy expression behind his eyes. "All right, Moony?" Sirius asked when they climbed into their beds, and Remus still hadn't spoken. "Yeah," came Remus's gruff reply. He rolled over, putting his back to Sirius, and that was that. Chapter 84. 5th Year. Secrets. Saturday, the 17th of January, 1976. "This is rubbish," James said, crumpling up a piece of parchment and chucking it into the fireplace. "Come on, don't whinge. You've just got to think of things that rhyme with Lily." "Like what?" "It's easy. Here." Sirius grabbed for another piece of parchment, scribbling a few lines. He set down his quill and cleared his throat dramatically, humming a jaunty tune. Oh dear Lily, don't be silly. I just want you to suck on my... Oi! James threw a book at him, and Sirius laughed as he dodged. What? You asked me for help? Singing songs about other women, Black, Mary said, arching an eyebrow as she flopped down on the seat next to him on the sofa. Should I be worried? Course not, he grinned, craning his neck back to look at the portrait hole. Where are Moony and Marlene? The three of them had gone to the library to study. Sirius had expected them to return together. Still in the library, Mary waved a hand. What are you lot fussing over? Trying to help James with his top-secret plot for our next Hogsmeade weekend. Oh, you don't say. And would that top-secret plot involve asking out a certain redhead that we all know and love? Oh, my dear lady, Sirius gasped, clutching his heart. However did you guess? James groaned, crumpling up another piece of parchment. Bugger it. It's hopeless, he muttered to himself. Not a single bloody idea. Mary and Sirius exchanged a look. Cheer up, mate, Sirius said encouragingly. Mary and I will be there to support you, and Peter and Desdemona, and Remus and Marlene, once I talk to him. Oh, you haven't asked him yet, Mary murmured absent-mindedly. She'd procured a nail file from somewhere, and was quietly working on her nails. Do you want me to talk to Marlene about it? I'm sure she'd say yes. Nah, it's all right, Sirius said. I can talk to Moony. At least, he was pretty sure that he could. The problem was that Remus seemed to be avoiding him, ever since the tapestry incident. Sirius wasn't entirely sure what he'd done to offend him, but for the entirety of the past 2 days, any time Sirius entered a room, Remus found some excuse to leave it. He'd talked to James about it, who'd suggested that maybe Moony was a bit miffed that he hadn't been more considerate. After all, they knew Remus was on patrol that night. Maybe their friend felt like they were taking advantage of his prefect status a bit too much. He could be touchy about things like that, sometimes. So Sirius had apologised, cornering Remus on Friday before he could dart off and saying, Sorry, Moony. I should have checked with you, or used the map or something. I know you hate all that girl stuff, and I know you've done loads to keep us out of trouble this year, so... Remus had sighed for a moment, appearing to contemplate. Then he shrugged and said, It's fine. Bound to happen at some point, I suppose. But he continued to avoid Sirius, even after accepting the apology. Are you sure he's not just busy, mate? James asked, when Sirius complained. He's got that study club and everything. Sirius huffed, crossing his arms. But it's just me he's avoiding. I saw him talking to Pete earlier in the common room, and he left right after I sat down. James shrugged. It's probably just the moon. He's always a bit off near the full. This was true, but it didn't make the behaviour any less annoying. Still, Sirius decided to take James's advice, again, and wait until after Sunday to talk to Remus about it, just in case Potter was right, and it really was nothing more than pre-moon jitters. Monday the 19th of January, 1976. Full moons were quickly becoming Sirius's favourite time of the month. The wolf trusted them completely now, and they'd begun to leave the shack and explore the Forbidden Forest. This made the transformations much easier in some ways, as they didn't have to worry about the wolf getting so frustrated from being cooped up that he accidentally hurt himself. In other ways, it was a challenge. As in his human form, Wolf Remus was just as difficult to dissuade when he set his mind to something. We can't stop you chasing rabbits if you want to chase rabbits, James said bluntly, when Remus began to panic the next morning as he realised there was blood on his tongue. You seemed pretty happy about it at the time. And it was bloody fun, Sirius added, licking his lips as he remembered the thrill of running beside the wolf, hunting down the skittering animals. Remus was not amused by the pun. You were encouraging me, he accused, dressing awkwardly underneath the blanket. You ought to know better. You lot have self-control. Yeah, Sirius shrugged. But when I'm a dog, I'm a dog. It's what we do. He didn't understand what all the fuss was about. It was so much simpler to just embrace the animal when you transformed. Besides, it was nice to let loose, and Remus certainly seemed like he needed it. He was so uptight lately. Don't worry, Moony, James said around a yawn. We wouldn't ever let you hurt a person. And you did have fun, I promise. Remus frowned, but he didn't complain any further, instead yawning back and saying, You better be off. See if you can get a bit of kit before breakfast. Yeah, all right, James agreed, bleary-eyed. See you, Moony. Bye, Prongs. Prongs had been settled on thanks to Peter, who, in a moment of hilarious confusion one afternoon, had forgotten the word for antlers. They'd all laughed until their sides hurt, and the name had just stuck. Sirius's nickname had been decided on too, after a dare one night between him and James. They'd snuck out into the greenhouse under the invisibility cloak, hoping to pinch some prank supplies, and noticed a patch of biting thistles that Sprout was growing. Naturally, they dared each other to cross it, and when James transformed into a stag and easily trotted through it on his hardy hooves, Sirius had transformed as well. Unfortunately, the pads of his feet were much more sensitive. James had gloated all the way back to their room, and when he'd started calling Sirius Padfoot the next morning, neither of the others had batted an eye. With all 4 aliases selected, they'd finally been able to complete the Marauders' map, and they used it now to make sure the coast was clear as they snuck back up to the Gryffindor Tower. Once they were safely inside their room, all 3 boys collapsed, exhausted, into their beds. Within moments, they were asleep. Sirius yawned his way through classes, fighting desperately to keep his eyelids open. While he wouldn't miss a full moon for anything, the morning after was always rough, especially when it was a school day. Remus, of course, was exhausted from classes, but unless the other Marauders wanted to reveal their illegal animagi status for a few extra hours of sleep, they simply had to tough it out. Still, Sirius managed to make it through, and as it drew closer to the midday break, he even began to perk up a bit. Now that the moon was past, Sirius thought Remus should be back to normal. He was very much looking forward to things going back to the way they were before the whole tapestry fiasco, especially because he still needed to pitch the Hogsmeade idea, and he was planning to do so that afternoon. When Sirius stopped by the hospital wing, he discovered that Madame Pomfrey had already discharged Remus earlier that day. Normally, the next place he would look would be the library, but Sirius had been avoiding the library ever since he arrived back at Hogwarts. It was stupid, he knew, and something he'd have to get over eventually, but the thought of walking into all those tall shelves of books, towering around him like the way they had when, well, he just wasn't ready yet. Fortunately, Sirius didn't have to confront the issue. Upon his return to the Gryffindor common room, he spotted Remus the moment he was through the portrait hole. "Hiya, Moony!" Sirius bounded over, grinning. Remus was talking to one of his little followers from the study club, a 4th year whose name Sirius didn't quite remember. He was a mousy sort of boy who fidgeted nervously with his hands when he spoke, and the only reason Sirius recognised him was because he'd seen him hanging around Moony so much. "Hiya, Padfoot," Remus replied. His eyes crinkled in the corners when he smiled. "So, settle a bet for me and Prongs," Sirius said, ignoring the nervous 4th year. It was a bit irritating, the way he followed Remus around like a girl with a crush. The boy mumbled a goodbye and scurried off, good riddance, and Sirius flung himself onto the now vacant space on the window seat. "How many nifflers would we need to find Rowena Ravenclaw's lost diadem?" "What the fuck is a diadem?" Remus asked, bemused, as he lit a cigarette. "Like a crown." Sirius leaned over and plucked the fag from Moony's fingers, just because he knew Remus would let him. He took a drag as Remus pulled out another cigarette. "Why?" He paused to inhale. "Would you and James want a crown?" "Dunno," Sirius blinked, watching Moony breathe out smoke. "Finding treasure seems like a marauder-type pursuit. Hey, what did that kid want?" "Christopher." "Boring name." "Ah, he in your fan club?" "Study group." "Pfft, what did he want?" "He was asking me out," Remus said, and Sirius's brain short-circuited. "Asking him out? Moony? And with a... "Joking, Padfoot," Remus smirked, spying the look on Sirius's face. Sirius shut his mouth, feeling a rush of embarrassment. Of course Remus was joking. Of course he wasn't. Only Sirius would make that leap, would actually think that... He snorted, trying to save face. "Good one, Moony. Thought you were serious there." Remus continued to stare at him for a moment, but then just shrugged, taking another pull on his fag. "If you did fancy going out with someone, though," Sirius said, remembering why he'd come to speak with Moony in the first place, "who do you reckon? Lily or Marlene?" "Shut up," Remus grumbled, with one of his trademark eye rolls. "You're right," Sirius nodded, ignoring him. "Lily's taken. I mean, she doesn't know she's taken, of course. So Marlene it is. Hogsmeade on Saturday?"
Are you asking me out on Marlene's behalf?
Maybe.
No.
I can get her to ask you out herself if you want. Just thought you'd say yes to me. Sirius wished he knew what Remus was thinking. He was staring out the window, fingers grazing the cigarette at his lips.
Marlene's not interested in me, he muttered, exhaling smoke.
Course she is. You're friends, aren't you? Anyway, you have to come. We're doing it in support of James.
Now James is involved.
Remus sighed as he stubbed out his cigarette, standing and shoving the pile of books scattered around him back into his bag.
Lunch?
Yes. Sirius flicked his own cigarette out of the window and got to his feet. They walked side by side to the portrait hole. Yes, James is involved, he explained as they made their way to the great hall. We all need to be there, and ideally coupled up, so that he can ask Evans out.
James asks Lily out once a week.
True, Sirius conceded. But this time he's going in with a game plan.
Oh?
He's got a song and everything.
James writes songs.
Remus looked genuinely surprised and mildly amused. Well, I may have given him a hand. Anyway, we all need to have dates, to plant the idea in her mind. Like that Muggle psychology stuff. There was a name for it, which they'd just learnt in Muggle studies, but Sirius had been brainstorming lyrics at the back of the classroom with James.
As much as I'd love to see James make a brat out of himself in the name of true love, Remus laughed. I'm busy on Saturday.
Doing what?
None of your business.
Infuriating. And thrilling. Another secret. It seemed that just as soon as Sirius thought that he had Lupin figured out, a new layer was revealed. See, Moony, he sighed. This is why the girls can't get enough of you. So mysterious. Remus shook his head and shoved his hands in his pockets, clearly done with the subject. They walked in silence for a bit, and Sirius wondered if he was infuriating his friend. It was so hard to tell, these days, what might set Moony off. Had he mucked things up by bringing up the girl stuff again? Or was it something else? Hey, Moony.
Yeah?
Do you fancy Mary?
You what?
They were just outside the great hall now, and Remus spun around to stare at him. Sirius flushed, fiddling with his earring. At first he wondered if he'd guessed correctly, but the shock on Remus's face didn't seem to hold any trace of guilt. He just looked baffled. Well, you've been a bit off since we started going out, and I've hardly seen you since the tapestry fiasco. Remus snorted, as if he was acting ridiculous.
No, I do not fancy Mary.
Sirius felt a wash of relief. He wasn't sure what he would have done if Remus had said yes. Okay, good. He smiled blithely. So you'll be Marlene's date?
Still busy. Sorry.
Saturday the 31st of January, 1976. Normally, Sirius might have begged, pleaded, cajoled, and generally made a nuisance of himself until Remus admitted what he was up to. But things had been strange between them recently, and he didn't want to press, hesitant to risk pushing Moony any further. So he just let it go, allowing Remus to keep his mysterious secret, even when he saw him borrowing the invisibility cloak, which almost certainly meant he was up to some sort of mischief. But even though he didn't push, Sirius was still distracted during that Hogsmeade weekend. He kept glancing at the door to the Three Broomsticks, wondering what Remus was up to. Mary even got a bit cross with him when he didn't pay enough attention to her story about something stupid that Isadora Finch had said in the hallway. She frowned and started pouting when he asked her to repeat it, and he had to spend a few minutes winning her back with compliments. By the time James was gearing up for his big moment, Sirius was beginning to wonder if he should warn his friend that having a girlfriend wasn't always what it was cracked up to be. The song went over quite well. In fact, Sirius thought he would go so far to say that it went swimmingly, as by the end of it James looked like he had taken a dip in a pond full of butterbeer. Lily huffed and left them all laughing at the table as she stomped off to get a new drink. But when she returned, she was pink-cheeked and very smug, which Sirius thought was evidence that she didn't really mind James's antics as much as she liked to pretend. James moped like a kicked dog across the table, sneaking mournful glances at Lily and dripping butterbeer onto the floor. It was around that time that Remus reappeared, from whatever secret mission he'd gone off to. "Moony," Sirius grinned, waving him over. "You missed all the fun."
"Yeah, sorry."
Remus nodded at the packed table, raising an eyebrow when he saw the state that James was in, and pulled out a chair.
Sirius flagged down the barmaid for another butterbeer. Remus looked pointedly between James and Lily. How is everyone? Peter began to giggle, still recovering from an earlier bout of hysteria. He clamped a hand quickly over his mouth, as if to prevent himself from falling into pieces once again, as the whole table turned and glanced at their poor, soaked friend. Oh, quite well, Moony, quite well, Sirius smirked. I was just saying, it's been a while since the Marauders have done a proper prank. You put stink bombs under the rug in the Slytherin common room last week, Lily said. And yesterday you reversed the lens on all the telescopes in the astronomy tower, Mullion pointed out. And you said that tomorrow you were planning to... Mary started, but Sirius interrupted her. Yeah, but those are all child's play, he said dismissively. Plus, that was just me and James mucking about. A proper Marauder prank needs all four of us. Remus doesn't want to join in with your silly pranks, Lily sniffed. Remus frowned. Yes, I do, he said, a bit belligerently, and Sirius caught his eye, beaming, mind already spinning with ideas.